Hi, everybody. John Flanders here with another interview, this time with Mat Callahan, who happens is American living in Switzerland, a musician. And Matt, could you start out by explaining a little bit about what you do and why you ended up in Switzerland?
Yeah, I'm a native of San Francisco, spent most of my life there, and as a musician and a political activist. I came over here actually on tour as a musician and then ended up landing a job producing records and whatnot. But I stayed in part for the work and in part because I um, uh, got married to a Swiss woman, a musician, my partner, Yvonne Moore. But in any case, I've ended up living and working here for the last 20 years.
Could you tell us a little bit about how the experience of this pandemic is going in Switzerland and how it affects you
I'm
as a
sorry, you
musician?
broke. I'm sorry, you just broke up, John. I couldn't understand the
Okay,
question.
could you explain a little bit how the pandemic is affecting people in Switzerland and how it affects you as a musician, you and Yvonne?
Well, yeah. First of all, there's no concerts. We had a tour canceled, which happened to be in the States in April. That was canceled there, but the same thing has happened to musicians throughout Europe, really. I would say it's happening throughout the world, in fact. But in Switzerland, the all of the clubs, all of the all gatherings, public gatherings of larger than like 5 people have been shut down for 2 months. They're going to loosen that up, but they're not going to allow big concerts for sure. I mean, I think the rest of the year there won't be anything like large venue gatherings, all the festivals that Switzerland's famous for in the summer are shut already. There was some discussion in the early days in mid-March about everything just being postponed to October, that kind of talk, but that's over. I don't think anybody's seriously considering getting back to any kind of a normal gig schedule, live concert schedule this year. There may be some at the end of the year. There may be some, ebb and flow in terms of like sizes. For example, they might allow concerts of under 200 people or something like that. But the other side of it is that will the public come out? Because if people are afraid of catching a deadly disease, they're not likely to show up anyway. So you can even allow the easing, if you want to say, but aside from necessary functions like seeing your family or your loved ones or going to work or whatever, are people gonna is the public going to turn out? So one of the things that's happened is that there has been, first of all, there is financial support for musicians. You have to show that you had gigs, you had concerts that were canceled, and then you can seek reimbursement for your lost wages. There are also various programs. For example, I'm a partner in the studio, and right now the studio is being used for live broadcasts. The musicians are socially distanced. They're separated by actually about 6 or 7 meters, which is about 12 feet. They're not even that close, and there are plexiglass barriers between the musicians and their microphone and each other, and the engineer sits in the control room anyway, which that's normal for studios. And so they're separated, and they disinfect all the controls, the computer controls, the microphones, and so on. And they've been doing that for the last almost a month, and that's sponsored by one of the radio stations in Basel. And basically it's a means of employing musicians. That they say that openly. It's like, let's find ways that we can actually keep musicians employed. And frankly, it's a drop in the bucket. I mean, let's face it, this is a stopgap measure. It's not a long-term solution. First of all, there's a lot more musicians than fitting 3 guys into a studio. I mean, let's face it, there's thousands of musicians who are out of work.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me that I suppose live streaming might be one way of doing concerts, but it's hard to see how they're going to get those vast music festivals going again. Do you tour in Europe very much? I mean,
Yeah, a fair amount. I mean, not a lot, you know. I mean, but we certainly, you know, we play in Germany, we play in Italy, we play in England, Ireland. Um, so you know, the neighboring countries around where we are. And of course, Europe is, compared to the United States, it's much smaller. So obviously, these distances are like going from New York to Chicago or something like that. It's not vast areas, but you know, the effect that it's had on us is that, yeah, we've had actually a couple of different tours canceled, and they weren't big things, and we weren't completely dependent on them for income as some people are. You know, my partner Yvonne also works. I'm retired, and I do other kind of work myself. You know, I do other jobs, you know, engineering jobs and whatnot, that are not affected by you know, the lockdown.
you also write books. I mean, you've written several books, correct?
Right. Well, yeah, I mean, that's the other thing, is I'm an author. And so a lot of my work is actually, you know, in reading books like those behind me. I mean, studying, research, preparing for, you know, an essay or an article or a book review or a book or whatever, you know. I mean, so I spend a lot of time alone anyway. You know, it's not in that sense, I'm not that adversely affected as many people are.
Yeah, you're kind of in the same boat I'm in. I'm retired and able to stay home. I'm fortunate in that respect, I guess.
Yeah.
Um, could you talk a little bit about the reaction of the Swiss people? I mean, it's a complicated country with different zones, Italian, French, German, and so on. Could you talk a little bit about the reaction in the various parts of the country to the pandemic and their view of the United States, particularly as you
Yeah,
see?
I mean, first of all, the zones that were, you know, the first hit were, of course, the Italian Ticino, which is, you know, adjacent to Italy, and it was the most immediately and the most hard hit of all the cantons, because the outbreak in Europe really began on a mass scale in Italy. And in fact, there were, you know, prior to the pandemic, there were more than 4,000 healthcare workers commuting from Italy into Switzerland every day. So there was, you know, concern not only about the spread of the pandemic, but also they need nurses, they need people to treat people, and so there was tremendous concern right away. Um, in likewise in Geneva, because it's surrounded by France, and I mean literally surrounded. If you look at a map, it's like a peninsula that sticks into France, and so there's an enormous amount of cross-border traffic there, all of which has been stopped completely. But I'd say, generally speaking, the reaction on the part of the government was relatively fast, although it has been severely criticized by several Swiss doctors who were frontline caregivers in actually in other parts of the world, and criticized, I think, along the same basic lines that are being mentioned in the United States and elsewhere, that government put the economy first and public health second, until it was actually forced by the medical establishment or by doctors and epidemiologists saying, you can't do this. You're literally going to have the blood of thousands of people on your hands. And they admitted that, actually. I mean, this is not me ranting. This was publicly acknowledged in Switzerland, that the government was forced to take these measures. And they acted very quickly, as did the Germans, certainly more quickly than the Italians did, and immediately gave financial aid, not only to the banks, as you would expect, or what's happened in the United States, but actually to workers, musicians, people who lost their income and so forth, at least on a temporary provisional basis. In other words, they're actually giving out money. I mean, it's not just talk. It's not just you know, PR posturing. People are actually collecting money. I know people who are getting paid, because they showed that their small business lost income and they got paid. They were lost their job and they just got a check for $5,000 just to cover their rent and living expenses, things like that. So in the short term, the response has been very good, I would say, overall, and there has not been anything like the experience of Italy, Spain, and now the United States, where you have real spikes in death rates and so on and so forth. They took these steps initially, as I'm sure most of your listeners know, to prevent the overwhelming of the health service, to dampen the effects of the pandemic, so that they could accommodate the increase in people needing respirators, needing beds, and so on and so forth. And they were successful in doing that. I mean, if there's a small lesson to be learned here, is that if you stop the attack soon enough, and you have in place already a decent healthcare system, then you can mitigate the results. At least, we've seen that here. The question, of course, is the longer term one, and what the nature of pandemics really is. And so that's where the controversy remains. And I don't think it's that different than the arguments that are going back and forth in the United States. In other words, should we open up the economy first? Don't we need to get people back to work? And so on. So you hear some of the same things here being voiced, and often by the same forces politically, meaning right-wing, fascist type people who, their freedom is being impacted, and so on and so forth, and they're not concerned at all about the public good, and they certainly don't want to see the social the transformation in people's consciousness that this provides us the opportunity to achieve. In other words, they're conscious of the fact, more than anything about the medical side, that the demands for free public health care, period, no conditions, no strings attached, are obvious. Everyone sees it now. There's nothing that can justify what's been happening in most of the capitalist countries of the world. The second thing, it's obvious that if you're looking at the results of no planes flying, and you're looking at the results of oil being worthless, why do we have to delay the transfer from fossil fuels to other forms of sustainable, clean energy, basically? There is no justification for it anymore. And when Greta Thunberg stands up and says, well, you said you couldn't do it, now you've done it. People, that resonates. People see that. And it's very hard to put that genie back in the bottle, particularly in a place like Switzerland. So, and the third thing, of course, the other major issue that concerns the right wingers and the people that are calling for an immediate opening up and let's save the economy is militarism and war, and the vast sums of money that are spent on weapons that could be spent saving lives. And not only that, the sanction regimes against countries like Iran and so on are completely they're anti-human, they're immoral, they're completely bankrupt as far as common decency and goodwill. But more importantly, they're counterproductive, particularly in the case of a pandemic, where it makes no sense to make one country suffer when you need the entire human population inoculated. The whole goal of a vaccine, or the whole goal of from an epidemiological point of view, is that 7.5 billion people get inoculated. So what is putting sanctions on Iran going to accomplish? Nothing. It's completely counterproductive. So people see this, and this is the genie that has come out of the bottle now. And it's going to be extremely difficult for them to put it back in the bottle unless they get everybody back to work right away. And the problem there is that, unfortunately, the virus will not agree. The virus will not retreat. The virus will come back, and every epidemiologist in the world is saying that. So what we're the situation you're going to learn it again.
What about the great power rivalry between the United States and China? Can you make any generalizations about how Europeans are looking at that?
Well, of course, it's very complicated, but in a nutshell, in a very simple scenario, you can see that there is great tension between what are called the Atlanticists, the people that want to stay vassals to the United States. They basically want to be the second-rate, the flunkies of the United States. They would prefer to be junior partners with Goldman Sachs and Amazon than they would be independent. But there are also forces within the oligarchies in Europe, including in Switzerland, but certainly in Germany, Siemens, Krupp, Thyssen, these big corporations. They want to do business with the Russians. They want to do business with the Chinese. They see their fortunes waning for example, the Nord Stream gas pipeline that the Russians are building to bring gas to Germany. And Trump and the it's not just Trump though, it's the whole U.S. Oil industry has been trying to prevent that from happening so they can sell liquid national gas to Germany with tankers, with boats. I mean, these are just you might even call these somewhat superficial, but they're examples of how within economic terms, leaving aside geopolitical rivalries and great power struggles, there are tensions between the ruling elites within all of the big West European countries and the United States. So the way that shakes out, of course, for the average person is, I mean, so what? Who cares? But it comes out in the media. The uptick of anti-China stuff comes out at one point, or demonizing Putin, or attacking anything that smacks of support for that side of things. It becomes increasingly difficult in the current climate because the United States is making such an ass of itself. It's becoming much more difficult for the Atlanticists to defend being a junior partner to the United States. The United States is off the rails. It's completely, I mean, the average person in Western Europe views the United States with, utter disdain and contempt, if not fear, because it's so crazy. And it's not just this pandemic. I mean, the pandemic is more like the icing on the cake. It was before that. It was the way the whole 2008 crisis was handled, the way the one thing after another, whether, it's like almost every day you'd open the paper and there would be some outrage committed by the United States government. And in some cases directly affecting Europeans, like some of these sanctions and attacking, Germany or some other country for its business deals with Iran, or its business deals with China or something like that, or it can be very much political things that the ramping up the Cold War with China and stuff like this makes no sense to the average European. It's irrational. It's all it's going to bring is misery. So they see the United States doing that, and of course, I've not mentioned the word Trump because that's the obvious thing to say. It's Trump. It's not Trump. It's the United States. It's the way the United States appears to the world. And I should say, I say that because everybody seems to forget George Bush. I mean, George Bush did all this too. And the attitude towards Europeans, towards George Bush, was the same. This guy's a buffoon. He's a complete idiot. He can't put a sentence together that makes any sense. And he wants us to join the United States in invading Iraq, who had nothing to do with 9/11. I mean, it's like this kind of insanity over a 20-year period. We're talking 20 years now. This is a long time. There are a lot of people who were born in 2001, and they're now 19. They're looking at this and they're saying the United States has been a completely dysfunctional society for my entire life. you know.
How then would you explain the fact that the European governments all pretty much joined the United States in recognizing the regime of Juan Guaido in Venezuela? I mean, there seems to be what you're saying, it seems to me, is that there's a big gap between what the European on the street thinks and their governments.
There is a very big gap. It's widening. You can see it in many different manifestations. And remember, the European countries, the states, actually represent real, cultural, political, historical differences, unlike, say, Oklahoma versus Texas. And Europe could fit within half the United States, Western Europe. So,
Yeah.
we're talking about a small area with a large number of different countries, different languages, different attitudes, and so on and so forth. So when we speak of that, you have to keep that closely in mind. I mean, Ireland is in the EU, but Ireland was a colony.
Right.
And not only was it a colony, it still is a colony in many respects. It is still controlled by British banks and American banks and so on and so forth. So, there are different aspects of what Europe is that explain the gaps between public opinion, or the man on the street, or the person on the street, whatever you want to say, and the governments that represent those people. And I would say that, for example, in the case of Switzerland, the balancing act that the Swiss government has played between more or less doing what the United States orders it to do versus doing what might be in the interests of the Swiss people is an old one. Switzerland has been neutral for 500 years. It has not fought a war outside its borders for 500 years. That's completely the opposite of the United States in every sense of the word.
But the Swiss were also famous as military forces for hire too, right?
Yes, they were the leading mercenaries in the Middle Ages. They were famous as fighters, tore the country apart. And in many ways, it was the opposition to the mercenary system that led to various revolutionary changes within Swiss history. It was opposition to the mercenary system, and that's that's getting really deep into like Swiss history.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's important, but it's not what we're really talking about here. The point being, what I'm saying is that there are powerful forces within Europe that are deeply opposed to what the United States is doing. And a lot of those things, you might say, were wished away after World War II. World War II and the victory of the United States set up a paradigm or a way of relating to America that has persisted until fairly recently. What's happening is that's breaking down. What is happening is that the goodwill created by the Marshall Plan and Western democracy and all the rest of this stuff has fallen. It's falling down. And that's why I mentioned that a person born September 11th, 2001 is now 19 years old. Those people have no connection to that legacy of World War II.
Right.
They don't. And all they see is what the United States is now. So the governments, on the one hand, are attached to that legacy. They're all products of that. They're all products of that Atlanticist mentality, that mindset of the alliance that won World War II. They're all products of that. But the children are not. And even my generation had the experience of the 60s. They talk about the 68ers. That's the people who fought throughout Western Europe against capitalism, against the Vietnam War, against the system, whatever. And it more or less corresponds to the same thing, the baby boomers, the radicals of SDS and the Black Panther Party and whatever in the United States. And this generation is fairly large, it's enough, some of us, to be active politically, active culturally, active in the arts and sciences and so on. And so the influence of these two things, the young cohort that has really no experience, no life connection to this old past, and a generation that actually fought against it, this is a powerful combination, and it's not going to go away. And the deepening crisis, which the pandemic just exacerbates, it was there already. It really took a precipitous drop in the 2008 situation, as everybody knows, with this experience with Greece and so on. And effectively, there was no recovery to speak of. And the consequences of that were felt much more deeply in Europe than they were in the United States. In many ways, the United States was able to kind of recover artificially, yeah, but they, full employment and all this other stuff that happened. So it was able to mask some of the damage, but the damage from the 2008 crisis never really went away in Europe. They were able to ameliorate it because there are social democratic institutions, providing better unemployment insurance, cradle to grave coverage, health coverage in some cases, not in Switzerland, but in some countries. There were mitigating circumstances that were there because of left-wing governments in the past, or because workers' struggles, or the struggles of socialist and communist parties over decades produced these results in European policy. But that didn't change the fact that there has been the crisis was enduring anyway. And so many of the problems that we're discussing now, whether it be free public health care for all, cradle to grave free education for all, an end to militarism, cleaning up the climate, all these things were on the agenda anyway. All of these things were at reaching a fever pitch in many countries and many elections going on in different parts and different times in Europe. And so the pandemic has simply shown that, on the one hand, the governments can do a lot if they want to. There's nothing stopping them shutting down, air travel and the rest of these things. So if that's possible, why can't they do the other things? It's exposing the ideological and self-interested, motives of the people running things, and that has had a what I consider to be already a profound influence. But what we can expect, I think, what we can anticipate is that since this is going to go on longer than a month or 2 months or something like that, where you might say, okay, back to normal, all right, we just it's not going back to normal, and everybody knows that now. I mean, I say everybody. Of course, there is no everybody. There are plenty of fools and ignorant, people who their heads are in the sand, or they don't want to know, or they have vested interests, whatever. There's sure. But I would say a very large number, if not a majority of people, are well aware that this is not returning to normal, and that normal was the problem.
Well, Matt, thank you very much for talking to us. We'll probably continue this discussion at some point.
Good.
Recording, but I think it was very interesting, and we'll get back to you at a certain point. And,
okay, great.
Okay, good. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, John. Thanks for the opportunity. Bye-bye.